Alright, so this is a video on distributive shock. Now this one's a little bit difficult to understand, but I'm going to try and make it as clear as I can. Alright, so this is, again, let's go over the labels. This is the PCWP, or the pressure in the left atria of the heart. This is the CO, this is called the cardiac output, or the amount of blood being ejected from the heart. And this is the CVR, or the systemic vascular resistance. All right, that is the amount of resistance in the blood vessels. So if the systemic vascular resistance increases, then the vessels are constricting. If it decreases, then the vessels are dilating. And then the oxygen saturation is the amount of oxygen in the blood. Okay, so let's go on to here, distributive shock. Now the key effect here is what you're going to see is what's called vasodilation. So the vessels are going to dilate, okay? That's the first thing to keep in mind, okay? That's the major disturbance. Dilation of the blood vessels, okay? Now there's many causes of this. You can have anaphylaxis, and I'm sure you've heard of that. They get stung by a bee and they go into anaphylactic shock, right? Well, what does that mean? Basically, the vessels are dilating, and their throat also can close up as well. Okay, and so another thing that you'll have is what's called neurogenic shock, right? So what that is basically there's damage to the nervous system, right? Maybe the person's had a spinal injury, right? And now the nervous system is damaged, so the vessels cannot constrict, so they are dilated. Okay, so those are the two main causes. So let's just go over the values. So because the vessels, now remember, the main disturbance is vasodilation, or dilation of the blood vessels. So you're going to see a decrease in systemic vascular resistance. Okay, that's the primary disturbance. Okay, and so as a result, the pressure in the heart is going to go down, right? Because essentially the vessels are dilated, so they're going to hold a lot more blood, and that's going to pull blood away from the heart. Now, what's going to happen is the cardio output's going to increase. Now, why is it increasing? It is increasing to try and compensate for the decrease in the systemic vascular resistance. Does that make sense? Because essentially this is going down. The systemic vascular resistance is decreasing. So the cardiac output has to increase to compensate for it. Okay? Now, what is the treatment, right? I'm sure you guys have all ever heard of an EpiPen. So you can use epinephrine for anaphylactic shock, all right? Now, epinephrine is going to bind to the blood vessels and cause them to constrict. And remember, that's the problem with distributive shock, right? So the epinephrine is going to cause constriction of the blood vessels, right? Now, you can also use phenylphenephrine for neurogenic shock, okay? So you can think of that as, remember, neurogenic shock is maybe there's a damage to the nervous system, and that leads to, again, vasodilation, okay? So phenylphenephrine will cause vasoconstriction of the blood vessels, okay? And then we can also use dopamine. Again, that's going to cause vasoconstriction, okay? So let's just go over this again. Okay, the primary disturbance in distributive shock, vasodilation, so a decrease in systemic vascular resistance. Again, the pressure in the heart is going to go down because the vessels are dilating. The cardiac output is going to go up to try and compensate for the vasodilation of the blood vessels. Okay, now how do we treat it? We want to constrict the blood vessels. For anaphylaxis, we use epinephrine, again, to constrict the blood vessels. For neurogenic shock, maybe the person's had a spinal injury, we use phenylphenephrine. And again, that just constricts the blood vessels. And you can also use dopamine, because that also causes vasoconstriction.